Ronald Reagan, 40th President of the United States. He died about 20 years ago. It was June 5th of 2004. He lived to the age of 93. Many would place him on the short list of great presidents in our country. He held 2 terms of office between 1981 and 1989. I was out of college at the time, but still not even aware very much of politics at all, or who was residing over the highest offices of the land at that time, busy with other things. But of course, like all presidents, he would have his critics. In fact, it's a fact of life in this age, in this human age, that all leaders will be criticized for one thing or another. In fact, this is just the way things are. But a Gallup poll taken in 2011 showed Americans who were asked who they thought was their nation's best president. The answer came through loud and clear. By far, the answer was Ronald Reagan. In 21 separate polls taken just since 1982 of Americans' views of the first 40 presidents of the United States, Ronald Reagan rated in the top 10 in 8 of those polls. Now, Ronald Reagan will be remembered for a number of courageous leadership decisions. It was a whole generation ago that he was in office, and many younger Americans won't know much about his legacy. Again, I didn't. And I was even 12 years old, living in California at the time when he was governor of California. And I was clueless. I remember my mother really admiring Ronald Reagan at the time as our governor. But I didn't pay any attention to the political scene whatsoever at age 12. I was busy with my hobbies and other interests. But here are a few of his legacy highlights. He helped restore the American economy from crippling inflation, runaway energy prices, high unemployment, and taxes. Aren't those things that we could certainly use in our nation today? He set a goal to reduce the size of American government. He so-called won the Cold War with the Soviet Union without firing a shot. He promoted godly morals of the American family, and he had a pro-life position. And he stood for the dignity of every human life. Those were just a few of the highlights that you can find online about Ronald Reagan's legacy. Now, my goal here in this introduction is not to lionize the man, President Reagan, but to point out another thing that he will be remembered for. He gained a distinguished title of being the great communicator. The great communicator. And what was it that earned him this title? Well, historians say that his language gave comfort in times of national tragedy. He gave vision and meaning to national triumph. He spoke in clear, simple terms, and he made complex international policy disputes understandable to millions of Americans, putting things in very simple language that most people could understand. But President Reagan's ability to reach people was not just from the style of his delivery. Historians say it boiled down to the content of his messages. The content. Reagan himself said this: "In all that time, I won a nickname, the great communicator, but I never thought it was my style or the words that I used that made the difference. It was the content," in his own words. Now, it is said that this great communicator could touch the common person with disarming logic and optimism. President Reagan would say things like, and I quote, "To believe that together, with God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans. God bless you and thank you." That would be a conclusion of a speech, and that was his manner. That was his pattern in those days. Now, he wouldn't take credit for the nickname, the great communicator. He added this. He says, I wasn't a great communicator, but I communicated great things. And they didn't spring full bloom from my brow. They came from the heart of a great nation. He was but one excellent communicator who served a role in American leadership. How important is it that you and I develop skills now as we're under training to become truly great communicators in this life? Now, notice I didn't say great orators in this life, but great communicators. And how important is the concept of becoming a great communicator to you and me as we are training in leadership for 1,000 years to come? In a word, I would say very important. So today I'd like to share with you 6 brief lessons, mainly from Proverbs chapter 15, on the wholesome, godly use of the tongue. My title is in the form of a question. How shall we speak? How shall we speak? Please do join me in Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1. And then we're going to start to see that there's a treasure in each of 6 short proverb sentences. Now, they're going to be accompanied by a few other companion proverbs, but these are lessons more valuable than gold and silver, more valuable than emeralds and rubies for the man or woman who is training for leadership, as we are and as we have been called to in this life. Now, as we look at these 6 facets of using the tongue in a godly manner, I'll borrow also a few quotations from our 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, and also a few thoughts from an acclaimed author of many books on leadership, John Maxwell. So we'll hear a few phrases from them as well. Now, the first of these 6 short lessons comes from a passage, again, in Proverbs 15, verse 1, if you're turning there with me. Proverbs 15, verse 1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Now, a companion proverb is probably very well known to most of us. Proverbs 25, verse 15, it says, a gentle tongue can break a bone. That's, again, a companion proverb. A gentle tongue can break a bone. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Now, to prepare to rule, we all need a peacemaking tongue that can stop quarrels before they start. And we're going to keep coming back to Proverbs chapter 15, but if you'd come to me to Proverbs 17, verse 14 for a moment, another companion or sister proverb here, Proverbs 17, verse 14, the beginning of strife is like releasing water. Therefore, stop contention before a quarrel starts. It's like a leak in a great reservoir or dam. A small leak can be patched quickly before it becomes a gushing wave of water that is very, very hard to hold back once it gets started. Proverbs 20, verse 3. Proverbs 20 and verse 3. It is honorable for a man to stop striving, since any fool can start a quarrel. It really puts perspective on the dignity and honor of a person who can manage the tongue in a peaceable way. Any fool can start a quarrel. And since we're in the remaining days, I would say the remaining weeks of an election cycle for the general election coming up November 5th, it's easy to see that American politics can hardly be respected and emulated by the world around us. By the nations and the national leaders around the world, they look at us and they see the same thing we do on the news, the withering remarks and ad hominem personal attacks on people in both houses of Congress, House of Representatives and the Senate. We see these things in these coverages in the news. And I have to say, I watch a lot more news than I did when I was 12 years old now. I really do. Ronald Reagan, in his perspective of dealing with issues that faced the nation, he said, peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the ability to handle conflict by peaceful means. Let me read that again. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the ability to handle conflict by peaceful means. In the John Maxwell's Maxwell Leadership Bible, he says, and I quote, "Once we master communication skills, then we can manage conflict. Remain calm and gentle when confronting conflict, and your example will become contagious." Again, John Maxwell wrote numerous books and thousands of lectures to large corporations and groups of people on leadership skills and leadership development. And there are very tense issues and, shall we say, crucial conversations that go on in business, in the corporate world, in the political world, and when the stakes are very high. And he says the example of remaining calm and gentle when thrown into a conflicting conversation, it becomes contagious. It starts to calm the whole group. What did Jesus Christ teach? Matthew 5, verse 9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Matthew 5, verse 9, one of the Beatitudes. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God for eternity." In the future, as glorified beings, your words and my words, think about it, are going to carry very great weight when we're instructing and coaching others, when we're deciding matters of judgment for 1,000 years. People are going to lean very heavily on your judgments and on your discussion points and on your ability to communicate with masses of people if that's where God places you and me. Now we'll keep our place in Proverbs 15. Please come to James 3 and verse 5, one of the classic areas talking about the use of the tongue, the proper use of the tongue. James 3 and verse 5. And while you're turning, another point from President Ronald Reagan. In his first inaugural address as governor of California, it was given in January 5th, 1967. Again, I was 12 years old at the time. He said, "If no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the ability to govern somebody else?" Very important words. If no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern somebody else? Let's go on to James 3 and verses 5 through 7. It's about governing ourselves first. James says, "Even so, the tongue is a little member, and it boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles? And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is also set among our members, that it defiles the whole body, and it sets on fire the course of nature. And it is set on fire by hellfire, the Gehenna hellfire in the Bible. That was an ever-burning flame in a pit where garbage and rubbish was taken in Jerusalem and thrown over the edge of the cliff. It was a constant burning rubbish pile, burn pile. And of course, the imagery goes on to the great fire at the end of the great white throne judgment, when there will be a hellfire and there will be those incorrigible that resisted change when offered to them, and they'll be burned up, and the memory of them will be gone. And so he's using some very strong words here, set on fire by the hellfire of Gehenna. Skipping back to verses 1 and 2, James 3, verses 1 and 2, my brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, also able to bridle the whole body. Well, that's not something that's achievable in its absolute sense, but what he's saying is if a person is able to control the tongue, he is certainly on the road to perfection. The Good News Translation puts it this way, my friends, not many of you should become teachers. As you know, we teachers will be judged with greater strictness than others. He's, of course, talking about the apostles. All of us often make mistakes. But if a person never makes a mistake in what he says, he is perfect and also able to control his whole being. James is telling us there is great power in the use of the human tongue. And now he would have been inspired perhaps by Proverbs 18, verse 21. I won't turn. Proverbs 18, verse 20, when it tells us, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. Either one. Those who love life will eat the fruit of good use of the tongue. Those who love death will use their tongue that leads to death. That's what he's saying here in Proverbs 18:21. So if in preparing for leadership we're given any kind of authority, even in this life, even now, it's combined with humility, and it strives for peace and peaceableness, what a truly uncommon combination of traits results. And yet this is exactly what Jesus Christ and the Father expects of you and me before we're given a crown and a royal scepter to rule. A tongue of humility and peace. Now here's an illustration on how important humility is in our leadership roles. And many of us hold some form of a leadership role in this life. If it's parenting at home, mom's taking care of little children, dad's taking care of their families, leadership in various aspects of our employment, even at schools, in our example in the schoolhouses. A guest visitor was in the White House one day interviewing President Ronald Reagan. He saw a sign on the president's desk that said, "A man can become too great in his own eyes to be used by God, but never too small." And many of us can already think of where that phrase came from. Well, the sign on his desk reflected 1 Samuel 15, verse 17 and 18. That's when Samuel was inspired by God to tell Saul, "When you were little in your own eyes, were you not head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel?" And of course, we know what happened to Saul. He rebelled against God. God gave him more than one chance until it got to a point where God said, "I'm going to raise up someone else to be king who's going to be better than you, Saul." And then we know the story of anointing young David while he was the youngest of a family of 7 boys, and he's out in the field, and he comes in, he's told to come back in, nobody's going to sit down until little David comes into the house. I don't know, maybe he was a teenager, but then he's anointed king, and then what's interesting next is another 20 years goes by before he actually takes rule. But those are tempering and testing years for David to mature to the point where he is given leadership over Israel. So having a peacemaking tongue and humility in our conversation, that's the first lesson from Proverbs 15, verse 1, in preparing for our 1,000 years of rulership. Lesson 2 out of 6 comes from Proverbs 15, verse 2. Please join me there again. Proverbs 15 and verse 2. The tongue of the wise uses knowledge rightly, but the mouth of fools pours forth foolishness. The NIV says, gushes folly. What is this telling us? We must speak honestly and accurately. This is lesson 2. We must speak honestly and accurately. Verse 7, Proverbs 15, verse 7 adds, the lips of the wise disperse knowledge, but the heart of the fool does not do so. The lips of the wise disperse knowledge, but the heart of the fool does not do so. And Proverbs 19, verse 1. Better is the poor who walks in his integrity than one who is perverse in his lips and is a fool. Blessed is even the poor person who walks in his integrity. Here's a quote from a book titled Reagan, A Life in Letters. It was published in 2003. Well, it's a compilation of letters from Reagan's early years, even as governor of California, into his presidency. He writes in one of his letters while he's governor of California in March of 1968, he writes this. He says, compromising with truth, no matter how trivial, does something to us. The next time it serves our purpose, we do it again and again, and one day we find ourselves in trouble and we're not quite sure why or how. You start to think about politicians that lie so easily. It just rolls off their tongue as if, it's just so common and everyone's doing it. And, if I get caught telling this lie, I'll just tell another one to cover this lie. And it just goes on and on and on. And we see corruption that is so disheartening. It's disparaging to see lies bantered back and forth in the political arena, even as this last week, watching little excerpts of the convention and other discussions and other, shall we say, rallies and things that are going on before the November 5th election. In John Maxwell's book, a different book, Developing the Leader Within You, he says, integrity is the human quality most necessary to business success, according to the 1,300 senior executives who responded to a survey. 71% of those 1,300 executives put it at the top of the list of 16 traits. Top of the list. Integrity in a leader must be demonstrated daily, he says. And I quote again, good character is more to be praised than outstanding talent. Most talents are, to some extent, gifts. By contrast, good character is not given to us. We have to build it piece, by thought, choice, courage, and determination, unquote. That again from Developing the Leader Within You by John Maxwell. Proverbs 12, verse 22. Let's take a look at that. Proverbs 12, verse 22. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord Eternal, but those who deal truthfully are his delight. Again, this is a quality of character that's sorely missing from so much of our current political discourse. Any leader for today and for 1,000 years must be trained to speak with integrity, making sure our information is honest, accurate, and truthful. So again, lesson number 2 out of the Proverbs is we must speak honestly and accurately. Lesson number 3 out of the 6. Our speech must be pure and undefiled by perversity. Our speech must be pure and undefiled by perversity. This comes from Proverbs 15, verse 4. Let's take a look at that. Proverbs 15, verse 4. A wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. The NIV Bible puts it differently. The tongue that brings healing is a tree of life, but a deceitful tongue crushes the spirit. Now, deceit and perverseness are slightly different. The Word Web Dictionary defines perversity, the number one definition, as deliberate and stubborn unruliness and resistance to guidance or discipline. That would be perverseness, unruliness, resistance to listening to guidance and discipline. Definition 2 of perverseness, deliberately deviating from what is good. We live in a tense social and political atmosphere in this country and in other countries around the world as well. Political groups and leaders at the highest levels have become corrupt. Many would rather resort to vicious personal attacks, as I mentioned earlier, rather than cooperate together. You hear the exception to the rule nowadays is when there's a discussion about a bipartisan agreement among our congressmen and senators. Bipartisan, it's becoming so rare to hear that. It's almost like, wow, you mean the whole Congress got together and decided something together in unison? Well, thankfully, there are a few honorable leaders. We do hear from them. But there are entertainment companies who churn out movies and recordings with vile language and behavior that encourages all the lowering of standards of dignity. What used to be a small counterculture, when I was growing up anyway, of profanity-laced sentences in music and media, has now become mainstream. It's so much a part of everyday speech. Whatever happened to parents who used to correct their children for saying bad words, for saying bad language in the home? Whatever happened to that? You wouldn't know that there are that many parents still helping their children to learn these things. But then the media barrage on kids watching media on X and on Instagram and all these areas that they watch, in the majority of their time in the news they get, young people in the Gen X generation, they're getting their news from these media outlets that they allow all kinds of things because it's supposed to be free speech. So I grew up in a different time. Sorry about that, but I did. Now I thought about enhancing what I just mentioned to you with a little bit of an audio illustration. I thought about this for days, wondering what should I state when I give you this little illustration of a little sound bite. Now, this is all just for effect, but don't you sometimes turn on the news and you'll watch a scene from the streets of some protest, or you go on some YouTube or some other social media site, and you hear people saying, well, entertainment companies of movies and recordings with language and behavior encouraging lowering of standards. What used small counterculture, profanity sentences, and now become mainstream speech. Do you hear that on TV and on social media? I do. And so I start going beep, beep. My wife doesn't like it when I do that. But then I stop and say potty mouth, potty mouth, potty mouth. So these people just, I just wanted to enhance that just a tiny bit. Teachers are afraid to teach morals and traditional values for fear of attack by the political correctness police. Political correctness police, I'll get it right. The moral foundation is being mocked in universities and classrooms and halls of justice and by other national leaders who watch what's going on in our culture. So it's very sad, but there is coming a new age filled with pure and decent language, where all nations will be taught to speak with a pure tongue, without perversity, and with sincerity and truth. After the flood, as we know, when the population centers grew and grew, before the Tower of Babel incident, The population of the world had one language. There was one language. But God saw how rapidly sin was increasing again after he destroyed all but 8 people during the flood. And then all again, the civilizations began growing again and repopulating the earth. Sin became rampant again, and we know what happened. Genesis 11, verse 1, I'll read it to you. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. So it says at the Tower of Babel, God suddenly gave different languages to all these people that started gathering in groups that could understand each other, and then they started migrating across the globe. Well, this may have been God's plan all along, to get people to disperse and fill the continents with people. But what a way to go about it, to have to force people into smaller groups that could understand each other's words. This was all to slow down the progress of man's wickedness. This is why God did that. Also, we learn in verse 9 of Zephaniah chapter 3. Chapter 3, 9 of Zephaniah. We're told there will be one pure language to replace all the languages on earth. God says, "For then I will restore to the peoples a pure language, that they may call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one accord." What does one language mean? That's obvious, but a pure language means something even more. Can having a pure language at the start of the millennium guarantee by itself that it's going to remain pure without profanity creeping into a language? Certainly not. Every language on earth, whether it's Swahili or German or Russian or Eskimo or Hindi or French, where did that term, "excuse my French," come from? Every language has its 4-letter words in the world. Every human language. Something is going to have to be done to perfect and protect and defend human language from becoming corrupted again by foul words. What will be needed is a pure heart in the human population, or the human language will become corrupted again. So here we are, you and I are called to exercise pure speech in this age, because we're surrounded in a world filled with corruption, profanity, rudeness, perversity, dissensions, lies, and the book of Proverbs has a whole bunch to say about the pain and damage that harmful words have on human beings. Proverbs 12, verse 18. Proverbs 12, verse 18. There is one who speaks like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise promotes health. There's a flip side of a coin in this proverb. But there is one who speaks like the piercings of a sword, hostile verbal attacks, slander, gossip, rumors, false accusations. Those are all handled by different proverbs and different scriptures in the Bible. Like a sword, they wound the reputation of those against whom they are uttered. Like a sword, they divide and cut the bonds of love and relationships. Like a sword, harmful words can separate those who are even closest together with each other. On the other hand, there are proverbs that teach us that words can be gracious and kind and bring about emotional healing and even physical healing. So a companion verse is found in Proverbs 16, verse 24. Proverbs 16, verse 24. Pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the bones. Proverbs 20, verse 15 adds this. Proverbs 20, verse 15. There is gold and a multitude of rubies, but the lips of knowledge are a precious jewel. Quoting John Maxwell again from his Leadership Bible, he says, if we use our words to foster healing, we fix the problem, not the blame. We're on the way to fixing problems when we use words that foster healing. Please hold your place in Proverbs. We'll come back to Proverbs again. Let's go to Ephesians 4, verse 29 together. Ephesians 4 and verse 29. As you're turning, this goal must be reached for which we are in training now in this life. Because once again, God plans to grant his servants, his faithful, his overcomers, huge influence for 1,000 years in the coming age. Huge influence. Ephesians 4, verses 29 through 32. Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. Do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you are sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you, with all malice. And be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. So, once again, how we handle our conversations now is directly related to how we're going to handle our conversations as powerful spirit beings, given authority to rule over cities and nations. So lesson number 3, our speech must be pure and undefiled by profanity and perversity as we prepare to become future leaders. Lesson 4 out of 6 from Proverbs chapter 15. A virtuous tongue uplifts and brings comfort and joy to others. A virtuous tongue uplifts and brings comfort and joy to others. Let's go back to Proverbs 15 this time, verse 23. Proverbs 15, verse 23. A man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good it is. Verse 26 adds this, the words of the pure are pleasant. And a sister verse in Proverbs 25, verse 11, very well known for most. Proverbs 25, verse 11, a word fitly spoken is like, in the imagery here, apples of gold on a platter or a settings of silver. I think my wife and I own a platter at home that is, it's hammered aluminum, but it looks like silver, and it's got gold apples embossed or hammered into it. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful piece depicting Proverbs 25, verse 11. Now, part of our training for future roles as rulers, priests, judges, kings, is in kindness and graciousness in our communication. It is said of the Proverbs 31 woman, the law of kindness was on her tongue. A number of years ago, there was a short article written by a relationship counselor titled, Hang Up the Gloves. It was found in an Oprah magazine issue in August of 2004. It dates back a ways, but hang up the gloves. The article was about how to grow past destructive arguments in our relationships. The opening line went like this. You landed a few good jabs. You scored the final knockout point. But did you really win your last argument? Or did you just knock out your relationship? The counselor in the article was describing his sessions with a particular married couple, but he said that in his 24 years of practice, and I quote, the biggest source of conflict for couples isn't money, sex, fidelity, child rearing, careers, or in-laws. Oh yes, those are the critical conversations, but those are crucial issues, he says, but the biggest source of conflict is the natural human urge to win. to win the argument, wanting to win, wanting to be right, wanting to come out ahead, wanting to be the big cheese, he says, at the expense of others in a relationship, makes us feel strong, safe, gratified, and vindicated. He also adds, it's also disastrous for a relationship. And the article continues, it's human nature to think that the only two options in a relationship are either be the conqueror or the doormat. Winning an argument at someone else's humiliation makes some people feel triumphant for the moment, but the long-term relationships only hurt the relationship, unquote. Well, think about it for a moment, and I didn't come up with this concept, but each of our families is likened to a miniature laboratory of perfecting the art of communication. It's a miniature laboratory of perfecting that art. Families are fragile at times. Families are vulnerable. We tend to hurt those the most that we love the most, and those that love us the most tend to hurt us the most. Those are just parts of being in a close relationship. One thing we can try to do is think of our personal families as fortresses against what's going on in society around us. A little miniature fortress should be our family against all the pressures and the social forces that are negative and drag people down on the outside world. When the very fabric of our society is tearing us down, and because in the latter days we're going to see more and more, as Jesus Christ said, Matthew 24, verse 12, because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. We see that happening. We see that happening. So we must guard our hearts and minds to preserve what we can within the confines of our sphere of influence. And that sphere of influence starts in the home. Well, the article Hanging Up the Gloves continued, I quote, when people put down their boxing gloves and neither person in a two-way relationship is striving to win, but both striving to be Christ-like, both can take the prize. That's a true win-win situation. So lesson number 4 out of 6 was on developing a virtuous tongue that uplifts, that brings comfort and joy to others, and not have words that destroy and tear down. Ronald Reagan would say, I'm convinced more than ever that man finds liberation only when he binds himself to God and commits himself to his fellow man. Very noble words. Lesson number 5 out of 6. Lesson number 5. Leaders need a tongue that is tempered and not reactionary. Leaders need a tongue that's tempered and not reactionary. Let's go back to Proverbs 15 and now verse 28. Proverbs 15 and verse 28. The heart of the righteous studies how to answer. Let me pause with that. In recent years, I've given that more thought than most any other time in my life in this calling. The heart of the righteous studies how to answer. This becomes more and more true with more influence we gain in life, whether it's in leadership roles of on any level, any strata. How to answer when people ask us or want to challenge us, want to contend with us, want to bring up an issue that could spark a contentious conversation. The heart of the righteous studies first how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours forth evil. Pouring forth, spewing evil. Proverbs 18, verse 13. Proverbs 18, verse 13. Part of that is, he who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. And another companion passage, Proverbs 29, verse 20. Proverbs 29, verse 20. Do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than him. Do You see a man hasty in his words, there is more hope for a fool than for him. Can you think of some of the derogatory names that Jesus Christ was called that he refused to respond to in retaliation? Do some names like drunkard, glutton, demon-possessed, illegitimate, not specifically, but in a roundabout way, being accused that he was an illegitimate son, treasonous, blasphemous? And how did Jesus Christ respond to any of those derogatory names? I won't turn. Let me read this to you. 1 Peter 2, verse 21. 1 Peter 2, verse 21. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that you should follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he committed himself to him who judges righteously. He says, God, you are the neutralizer. God, you will bring justice. Put it in God's hands when these things happen. And Jesus Christ, too, had to learn obedience through the things that he suffered in this life. Now that he is tempered in his whole way of ruling and judging others, he can return to earth in all power and glory and majesty and rule with a rod of iron, subduing the nation with the consuming breath of his mouth. That sounds intimidating, but he can do that with the right amount of temperance that he learned as a human being. He can do that with the right amount of temperance he learned as he walked as a human being, and he shows us how to do it, and he told us how to do it. There is power in the use of the tongue. How shall you and I speak? I have another illustration here of mutual trust and mutual respect in relationships. This idea, or this concept, group of ideas, comes from another book, Crucial Conversations, Tools for Talking When the Stakes Are High, by Joseph Grenny and a couple of other authors, copyright 2021. Now, this book is 20 years in print. It's in its third edition. It's used very widely. It's considered a classic for 20 years now. I have a copy of probably the first edition at home on my shelf. Here's an illustration that is conveyed in this book. He says, a relationship is like money in a bank account. It can be invested. You can grow your bank account by putting more money into that account, and it can be withdrawn. You take money out of your account when you need it. To keep relationships healthy emotionally, each individual needs to put something of value back into that virtual bank account, a relationship bank account. Because why? Because it needs to keep growing. If everyone in a relationship keeps drawing out of that account by taking away the things that support and strengthen a relationship, eventually the account is depleted. There's nothing left in it to draw from. So before getting into really challenging what this book calls the crucial family conversations, again, the major topics, what are they? Their money, their careers, intimacy, fidelity, in-laws, child rearing. When we care about the other person and when we believe the other person cares about us, that's mutual respect. And that mutual purpose helps people get engaged in the crucial conversations in a good way and a healthy way. This way, each person in a relationship knows the intentions are honorable. Another point in the book, a safe conversation is when neither party feels threatened with an attack or an evasion of a crucial subject. the attack or the evasion. The author calls them violence in conversation and silence in conversation. And many families use one of those two tactics, rather knee-jerk reactions that they want to attack the other person, put down an idea, suppress a thought before hearing it out, or just have the silent treatment and say, oh, this conversation, we've had it too many times. It always leads to hurt, always leads to tears, always leads to anger. So we don't even go there anymore. We don't touch that conversation or that topic in a conversation because it's too sensitive. That happens. Mutual trust comes when both parties perceive that they're willing to work toward a common goal. Also, mutual respect is what's necessary in holding those dialogues. What happens when people perceive that the other person in a conversation doesn't respect them anymore or respect their ideas? Then the conversation becomes what the author calls unsafe. What happens when a conversation becomes unsafe? Well, it won't get resolved, for one, and two, at least one in the party feels like they've been robbed of respect, and respect is like oxygen we breathe. If you take your breath away, all the oxygen is taken away from you. That's all a person can think about. You can't think about anything else if you're gasping for breath. It's all you can think about. The instant people perceive disrespect in a conversation, the interaction is no longer about the original topic. Suddenly it's about defending dignity. And suddenly someone's safety in the conversation has been violated. Instead, when we're building trust before engaging in crucial conversations, we state the issue, we work on just that one issue. We don't pile on everything at once, because sometimes, and we've done in our family over the years, we would bring up item after item after item in the same conversation, and it just piles on. Instead, it's best to deal with one issue at a time, one day at a time. This is all advice from the book, Crucial Conversations. Please turn to Philippians 2, verse 3 with me for some other wise advice from the Bible. Philippians 2 and verse 3. Here, Paul instructs us how to converse in a pure way, again, as we are preparing for roles of leadership in glory and honor for 1,000 years and beyond. Philippians 2, verse 3, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind. Let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for your own interests, but also for the interests of others. Skipping to verses 14 through 16. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. The Apostle Paul, before he died, he would look forward to seeing again at least the faces of those whom he influenced in a positive way, who were converted and who walked this way of life until the day they died. He will rejoice when he sees them. And then what's he going to rejoice about? He's going to rejoice about untold millions of others that also read his epistles and learned from them as well. And he's going to say, wow, look at all these people that God called and that God gave the right ingredients and formula for successful life. I won't turn, but Romans 12, verse 18 through 21 says this, Romans 12, 18 through 21, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. This is what Jesus Christ did when he was slandered and slurred and derogatory terms were thrown his way. Verse 20, therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Here's another little illustration from the life and leadership of our 40th President, Ronald Reagan. A guest in the Oval Office in the White House saw President Reagan's Bible sitting open on his desk. And it was opened to a particular passage that he had highlighted. He had marked on his Bible, and he left it open on his desk in the Oval Office. And of all the scriptures that was highlighted, it was this one found in 2 Chronicles 7, verse 14. This was God's response to Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the new temple, Solomon's temple. And when it said, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, that I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and heal their land. Now, underneath that passage that was highlighted in his Bible, his mother left a comment as a reminder of how he should keep that passage in proper perspective. His mother said here, in that she said, this is a reminder of how he should keep proper perspective in leading the nation. Son, this scripture is for the healing of the nation, quote unquote, by Ronald Reagan's mother. So lesson number 5 I chose in preparing for our future leadership was in developing tempered speech with kindness, graciousness, esteeming others better than ourselves. Finally, lesson 6 out of 6 teaches us that a tongue that blesses God spends time in prayer to its creator. The tongue that blesses God spends time in prayer toward its creator. Proverbs 15, verse 29. Proverbs 15, verse 29. The Lord is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayer of the righteous. Now, throughout the message so far, I've used some short phrases from the late Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, to share his philosophy, but he was just one example of being a great communicator. Jesus Christ himself overshadows any great communicators of all the ages. And Jesus Christ will continue to teach the nations with equity and fairness. He will rule with power and authority, again, tempered by humility and purity that he exercised in this human life. And he's teaching us to do the same thing today. Please turn to one final scripture with me in this message. Matthew 12, verse 14. Matthew 12, verse 14. It's a prophecy about the great communicator, Jesus Christ. As a lead-in, Jesus Christ went into a synagogue. He was being tested whether or not he would heal a man on the Sabbath. He was being watched by the religious leaders. Jesus went ahead and healed the man. And he looked at them and he said, therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Verse 14. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might destroy him. This was the turning point when they began to plot how to murder the very Son of God, the very giver of life, the Messiah that they had waited for hundreds of years for. Verse 15, but when Jesus knew it, he withdrew from there. It wasn't his time yet. And great multitudes followed him, and he healed them all. Verse 16, yet he warned them not to make it known, that it might be fulfilled what was spoken by Isaiah the prophet. Now here he quotes Isaiah 42, verses 1 through 4 in this prophecy. We're in Matthew 12, verse 18. Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will declare justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel or cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and smoking flax he will not quench, till he sends forth justice to victory. And in his name Gentiles will trust. In this prophecy, Jesus Christ, who would come hundreds of years after Isaiah, revealed himself as wise, humble, patient, long-suffering, full of divine mercy, and full of gracious instruction. From Barnes' Notes commentary on the Bible on this verse, Matthew 12, verse 14, a bruised, broken reed is an emblem of the poor and oppressed. It means that he would not oppress the feeble and the poor, as the victorious warriors and conquerors of the world did. It is also expressive of the soul that is broken and contrite on account of sin, weeping and mourning over transgression. He will not break the reed, that is, he will not be severe, unforgiving, and cruel. He will heal it, he'll pardon it, he will give it strength. And then when it came to the phrase smoking flax, Barnes' Notes on the Bible describes it this way. This refers to the wick of a lamp when the oil is exhausted. The dying, flickering flame and the smoke hang over it when the little tiny flame is about to be extinguished. It's an emblem also of feebleness and infirmity of the human condition. He would not further oppress those who had just a little bit of strength. He would not put out hope and life when it seemed to be almost extinct. He would not treat them harshly or unkindly, but will cherish the feeble flame, minister the oil of grace, and kindle it back into a blaze, unquote. One promise to such an overcomer is in Revelation 3, verse 21. To him whom overcomes, I will grant to sit with me on my throne, even as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. One of many promises to overcomers. So lesson number 6 out of 6 teaches us that a tongue that blesses God spends time with its Creator God in prayer. In conclusion, how shall we speak? I chose some passages in chapter 15 of Proverbs to show us how we take care of, how we converse to one another, whether it's to our spouse, our children, our relatives, associates at work, whether it's friends or strangers. Lesson 1 was having a peacemaking tongue that can stop a quarrel before it starts. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Lesson 2 was we must speak honestly and accurately. The tongue of the wise uses knowledge rightly. Lesson 3 was using a pure speech, undefiled with profanity and perversity. A wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. Lesson 4 was having a tongue that uplifts and brings comfort and joy to others. A man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good it is. Lesson 5 was having a tongue that is tempered, careful, and not reactionary. The heart of the righteous studies how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours forth evil. Lesson 6 was in developing a tongue that blesses God and spends time in prayer with its Creator. The Lord is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayers of the righteous. So hopefully we've learned some important things, especially as James chapter 3, verse 5 and Proverbs 18, verse 21 say, there's great power in the use of the tongue. And just like Jesus Christ was tempered in this human life, that he dwelt and he lived like you and me so that he might learn all the temptations that we go through and all the conditions that can beset human beings that we suffer through, that in our schools, in our homes, on our jobs, public places, we're preparing to speak like kings, like rulers, like priests, like judges. So how shall we speak? How important is it that we learn these skills now in this life to become great communicators? Ronald Reagan would say, if we don't do it, who will? If not now, then when? Will you and I be able to handle the power as a spirit ruler for 1,000 years and beyond?